Partly for our panel tonight, I'm going to give just a recap of what we've been doing. The first session, we had an introduction to the whole topic and with an overview, followed by Bob Jones doing Finding Your Customer, always a good presentation he does. Last night we did business models. You know, who's the customer, and then do you have a model that allows you to create value with a customer and then capture it through a business model. And Joost Bonson did a piece on organization and people issues, talking about companies that had spun out of MIT and some of the lessons learned there. And tonight we have Ken Zolot has assembled a panel. I'll let him introduce them. It's a founder's journey, something about learning from the people that have done it recently. And then at the second part of tonight, I'll bore you all with legal advice, but it won't cost you anything, so it'll probably get your attention. So with that, Ken, the floor is yours, sir.
All right. Thank you, Joe. Good evening and welcome. It's great to see this turnout. The entrepreneurship spirit around this place is amazing, and I've had the great pleasure of being part of it for a few decades now. And I thought the best way to talk about it was to bring you some live specimens. So I have students who sat in your seats a few years ago, some of them who were in my freshman seminar, and I will introduce them in a moment. So I'm going to give about 15, 20 minutes worth of intro material, and then we're going to turn it over to a panel where I'm going to ask our students some questions. I like that Joost was talking about organizational issues and team dynamics, because that's, I think, the most important part of this, and that's what I'm going to talk about as well. I should point out, by the way, as a way of kind of re-welcoming you, I know this is your third night and you've gotten the intro, but you're in great company here. The fact that you're sitting in a room like this in Cambridge, Mass, with other like-minded people, with all the folks, I mean, within a square mile of this place are some of the most remarkable startup resources in the world. And some of that is coming directly from Joe and Joost. All you have to do is talk to them and talk to their friends, and you've already got like the whole startup ecosystem from New England here. So it's great that you're here with them running the seminar. And in some sense, the people around you. This is, I sometimes nickname this phenomenon where Sergey met Larry. The people, really important founding teams come together at university settings and decide they like each other and want to work together, and this is where companies get born. So I hope you're not just looking to the stage for the interesting resources, and you're taking advantage of the fun people around you. And I will introduce our guests more properly in a moment. I'll let them introduce themselves, and we'll get them seated up here in a minute. Trang took my freshman seminar 4 years ago. I do a freshman seminar, an intro to entrepreneurship for incoming freshmen. Trang was a student 4 years ago. And is now in her first year of a master's degree. Catherine and Robert took it 3 years ago, took a semester off to go to Y Combinator on the West Coast to explore a startup. And Ashwin actually took this class 3 years ago and is now on his own startup journey. So again, I thought it would be fun for you to see what happens when you wind the clock forward a little bit from where you're sitting now to where ventures get started. And about myself, just those of you who haven't met me yet, I started as a geek myself. I'm a computer scientist and a coder, and I did a number of software-based startups, mostly in the late 90s, and had some fun during the dot-com gold rush, and kind of got burnt out when that all crashed in the year 2000, and thought maybe I'll come back to MIT and just hang out here and teach for a while until the storm passes. And either the storm never passed, or I just had too much fun teaching. Because I've been devoting my life now, rather than starting companies, I'm helping people meet others who want to start companies. And one more fun little fact about me is a few years ago, the folks at Berklee College of Music asked me if I would help them start an entrepreneurship program for musicians. So I'm also a professor over at Berklee College of Music, and exploring the creative process and the artist's mindset and how performers and composers think about engaging with an audience is a really fascinating topic for engineers as well. So I'm going to stop talking about myself now, but if any of you want to connect with me later, I'm very reachable and respond to email well. I think you've probably heard most of the speakers so far, or if you've studied startups so far, most of the lessons you get in entrepreneur boil down to approximately 3 components, and in some different order. Some people will start by asking you, what are you building? What's your invention? What's your idea? Or what's the service you're providing? I think at MIT, that's a reasonable place to start. That's where most of you want to lead off. Some people will ask, and this is the way I sort of smugly phrase the market question. I ask, who cares? People tell me all about this wonderful gadget they have, and I say, well, that's all well and good. I'm sure there are lots of wires and springs in that thing you just built, but who cares about it? And so understanding who the typical customer is or what the total market size is a whole body of entrepreneurship itself and a whole area of study. And you can take multiple courses on market segmentation and customer acquisition strategies and product market fit and all that good stuff. And then sort of the third key ingredient is the human beings who are running this thing, which is why are we the ones to be running this venture? And if you've gone to a pitch competition and listened to people pitch, often they lead with something. They have some strong suit in 1 or 2 of these, and they're trying to figure out the third. You know, they lead by my co-founder and I are Nobel Prize winners, and we've got a 5.0 GPA, and one of us is best friends with Warren Buffett, and therefore you really ought to listen to us. And that's kind of boasting about how we've got a killer team. You don't really know what we're doing or who cares yet, but we're such great people that you ought to trust that we'll figure this out. And that can actually be compelling. And the middle category, some people say, you know, we're here to provide clean water to the whole world, or we want to provide broadband to rural communities. They start with some problem, even though they haven't really told you what the solution is. And that's a compelling way to start a pitch as well. And then there's the technology pitch, which you often hear at this place, which is, you know, I figured out a way to get these carbon nanotubes to dance in a way that no one's been able to do it before, and I published my results, and I can patent this. I have no idea who's going to buy it, and I have no idea who's going to help me launch the company, but isn't this cool? And again, that's sometimes a viable way to start. I've had the pleasure of hosting Drew Houston here. He was a mentee of mine when he was a student. He's heard me give this talk, and he said, oh, you're sort of like talking about oil drilling, which is, you know, if everyone talks about striking oil and striking it rich, you kind of want to know, are they using an oil drill that actually works? Is that the right thing? Does it have the right bit on it? Is it actually capable of drilling the earth? Is there actually oil down there? That would be another interesting question as well. And thirdly, do these guys know what they're doing? So the question of having a good technology, an addressable market, and the right team. And actually in the oil industry, a lot of really stupid people with rusty pipes who lived in Texas when they first figured out there was oil in Texas, all you had to do was go in I mean, the market was so amazing, the opportunity was so amazing that all they had to do was go in their backyard and stick a rusty pipe in the dirt, and they were rich. So there are times and places where one of technology, market, or team is your leading card. For the purposes of our discussion, and following up on what I said about celebrating Jost's conversation about team dynamics and organizational dynamics, I like to focus on the human beings and the question of who's in charge of this thing. And many of you have engineering backgrounds, I realize, and in some sense, you can think of engineering human beings. So when you're thinking of what tools you have at your disposal, I would suggest that the very first tool you ought to master is the mirror, and figuring out who am I and why am I doing this, what am I good at, who do I know, how do I like to work, all kinds of interesting questions, which I'm going to ask our panelists to get into. And just playing on the terminology that Joe uses for this class, since this is a room full of nuts and bolts, are you a nut or a bolt? And I just kind of made that. I don't know if there's a specific translation from that to a startup founder, but there are all kinds of people out there. And as with a nut and a bolt, which go together to form an important mechanical structure, you know, you need both. And if you have 2 nuts, it won't work. If you have 2 bolts, it won't work. So one of the reasons I describe this as the founder's journey is to think of the founder as a protagonist. This is your life story. You're writing this story. The people I meet who I get good feelings from, the people I meet who I sense are really going to be good founders, they have a certain sense of purpose about them. They're moving forward in a way that I know they're going to go somewhere. And I can sometimes tell this from their body language before I even hear what they're talking about. In some sense, it's a quest for joy or meaning, a reason to get out of bed in the morning and keep going. This gets into difficult things, especially from an engineering standpoint. If you're sort of dissecting yourself as a machine and understanding what's your source of propulsion, why do you keep going around to all your friends telling them about this startup you're launching? What's driving you to do this? I think that's where some of the most interesting questions are. There are 1,000 people over at Sloan who can show you how to do market analyses. There are all kinds of really talented people in the School of Engineering who could tell you how to do technology roadmaps and validate whether something works. The question of why are you doing this? Why do you get out of bed in the morning? How are you going to make your mark in the world? That's a deeply personal question, and one that I don't think people are given permission to spend enough time on. And it's often one which winds up tripping people up if they don't spend enough time thinking of it. Let me just show you one little amusing side comment on this notion of understanding your vision and your intention. This is a snippet. There's a very famous TED Talk from a guy named Sir Ken Robinson that you've probably all watched or been passed a copy of. He's talking about the way we inspire creativity and motivation in children and how we can improve our school systems. And he tells an anecdote of a little girl who was in the back of a drawing class. And I'll just play this for a second. It's about 20 seconds. This won't be a long thing.
I had a great story recently. I love telling it of a little girl who was in a drawing lesson. She was 6 and she was at the back drawing, and the teacher said this little girl hardly ever paid attention. And in this drawing lesson she did. And the teacher was fascinated. She went over to her and she said, "What are you drawing?" And the girl said, "I'm drawing a picture of God." And the teacher said, "But nobody knows what God looks like." And the girl said, "They will in a minute."
So that's my anecdote for founders. People show up with this crazy idea that they've discovered God, they know what this looks like, they know exactly what this company is going to look like, and most of the people you meet are going to be saying, "Don't be ridiculous, nobody knows what God looks like." And your job is to have the arrogance to say, "They will in a minute." And to have the confidence to believe in that vision, which borders on being delusional, and knowing how to take yourself through this is, I think, the core skill of a founder. So I'm going to tell you a couple more stories on mythology and numbers. First, the mythology part. So the reason I call this the founder's journey as well is based on the inspiration of an author named Joseph Campbell, who's sort of an anthropologist historian who's written about the arc of human history and the people we celebrate as heroes and myths and gods, whether it's Luke Skywalker or Buddha or you name your favorite iconic person on a quest. Campbell argues that they all follow an almost identical narrative, that all humanity in every culture and every language from the beginning of time has developed a way of worshiping someone who goes off and doing something amazing. This is a little hard to see, and I won't belabor the small print, but the quick version is that you start minding your own business in an ordinary world and you get called to action and go off on some journey. And then you are drawn into this unknown, mysterious world where you've kind of lost your way. The opening to Harry Potter, for example, where you get on this bus and all of a sudden, or this magic train, and all of a sudden you're going through this psychedelic world is a quintessential example of that. You fall down some rabbit hole, another example of that. And all of a sudden then you're in some crazy world where you're tested and exposed to dangers and goddesses and temptations. You have a near-death experience, you're resurrected. You finally figure it all out, bring back the riches, and you come back to society. You come back to where you were, but more informed and more enlightened, and you share your blessings with the community you came from. That pretty much every hero or God story that humanity has worshipped follows that approximate arc. And I would argue there's a similar path that we could describe for startup founders, and maybe when our students come up here, they'll talk about where they are on this cycle or where they've been over time. Again, if you just do a web search or even buy this book, it's kind of a fascinating read, and it goes through this all in great detail. So that was the mythology part. Now to some numbers, because we like to see data and we like to prove things. And one of my favorite sources for data is from a friend of mine, again, about founding team dynamics, from a friend of mine named Noam Wasserman, who used to be around here. He taught at Harvard for a little while and then got lured out to the West Coast. Apparently he got tired of this cold weather, and he's at the University of Southern California now. And he's got a landmark book called Founders' Dilemmas, where he goes through these issues And I'm going to steal some of his slides. There are times when I've co-taught with him and he's guest lectured in my classes, and I've seen him do this enough that I'm going to imitate Noam for a minute or two, because I think he does a really good job. So I'm an engineer and sort of an informal advisor to entrepreneurs. He was like a serious professional business school professor. So his job was to do research about this and write papers on it and get hard data. My job is more to tell stories and mentor people and trade in anecdotes. And he trades in real data, which is why I think this is interesting. And he also has some fun graphics in his slides, and his opening is causes of failure in venture capital-backed startups, which I'll grant you is a small subset of startups. Venture capital is not the route for most startups, but it's the easiest group to study because you can go interview venture capitalists and ask them who their portfolio companies are. And not surprisingly, he points out that about 2/3 of, and this ticking time bomb, 2/3 of blow-ups, he's talking about companies that crash and burn, 2/3 of these are because of founding team dynamic issues. And about 1/3 are because either the product doesn't work or the market's not there. And I can confirm that. In my personal interaction with students, it's even higher than that. When I hear from a student who studied with me 5, 10 years ago and reaches out to me and says, oh, can I come talk to you? I got a serious problem. The serious problem is never, oh, the technology doesn't work. Serious problem is never, oh, the customers don't want to pay the price I'm charging. They can figure that stuff all out. What they come to me and say is, oh, my co-founder's possessed by the devil, and I can't spend another minute in the same room with him or her. And we hate each other, and we're going through an awful divorce, or maybe we're going to make up and we're going to figure it out. But figuring out, or my co-founder, had some weird situation, a member of his family sick, and now he needs to move overseas, and he wants to leave the company. Weird stuff happens with human beings, and that's almost always the source of angst for startup founders. Professor Wasserman also has this framework he calls the 3 R's in human dynamics, which are relationships, rewards, and roles, which he points out that every startup team needs to think through. And we have an interesting cross-section here of founders and people with different relationships with their co-founders, which I think it's important to think about as well. I'll talk a little more about that in a minute. One bit of data, he showed the founding team stability. So on the bottom is the number of months that the company has been in business. So on day 0, these are obviously the same and they're all 100%. The team has the exact same number of founders that they started with. But as you go out into time, you see that they start to dissolve. Founders flake out, the teams get smaller. And the red line is a team that flakes out more, and the blue line is one that stays together more. The red line is teams that started as friends or lovers or relatives. The blue line is companies that started as strangers. And the data showed that you're more likely to stick with a stranger than someone you know and like, which is kind of interesting and counterintuitive. And another phenomenon about this, I told you he uses goofy graphics. This is a flaming mess on the left side. This is a ball of fire showing that this danger zone here, which has to do with the disparity between these two curves, the upper red curve being the damage you'll undergo if the relationship blows up, compared to the likelihood of discussing so-called elephants in the room, which is difficult things. Telling someone they don't know what they're doing, telling someone they shouldn't be in charge of the company, telling someone that they're not a good negotiator. Yes, question?
On the previous slide, do you know why there seems to be some separation point? Like they're tracking pretty well, and then after some number of months, it seems like they really start.
Yeah, that's when the split off happens. I would guess that's and that's a good question. I don't know the exact answer. I would guess that's the basic honeymoon period that almost all founding teams, once you go through all the effort to start a company together, you're not going to break up within a few months or even a year or so, that it takes a while for these cracks to start to emerge and for someone to flake out. But this disparity between how likely you are to confront someone about a problem, which you're less likely to do with a friend or a relative or a lover than you are with a stranger. And the reason it's important to understand this slide and learn about how this has happened is the good news is this is fixable. If you sit down with your friend and you say, look, I know I love you and I care about you, we've been best friends forever, and I'm never going to try to directly insult you, But at the same time, there are going to be times when I think you're really screwing up, and we need to come up with some code system. Or like, maybe we go into a room and we put some blue sticky notes on the wall and say, okay, here's the zone of confrontation, and we'll talk to each other, and then we'll take the blue sticky notes down, and then we'll know we're just friends again and everything's fine. I'm sort of making this up as a silly example, but there's sort of ways to work with people to figure out how to have difficult conversations and get over issues without insulting them. I've also heard people who grew up as brother and sister. The Collison brothers, famously, who started Stripe. Patrick was an MIT student and a mentee. He argues with me about this. It says he and his brother got so good at beating each other up all their lives that all they did was wrestle and yell at each other, that this was a natural for them. They had no hesitancy to discuss elephants in the rooms. So maybe with brothers, and especially brothers of close age or sisters, this doesn't apply. Yep, another question.
There must be some distribution with people who started as friends to start a company and people who started as strangers, right? Because what brings those strangers together if it's not their friendship must be the idea, right? So there must be some distribution of people who started as friends who just want to make something happen, but had a terrible idea to start with, which led to them falling apart eventually because they disagreed about the dynamics. And then strangers, they agreed at the beginning on what they wanted to do. And does that play at all into that?
Yeah, and I think for the purposes of this data, it's the moment people met and founded the company. If they didn't know each other but then became friends in the course of running the company. I actually had students in my class. I consider myself a founding grandfather, if you will. I had students in my class decide to work on a project together, fall in love, get married, and they just had a baby. That's the first time I've produced a baby in one of my classes, and that was kind of cool. And you'll meet Catherine and Robert in a moment, who met each other in my freshman seminar and became close in the course of working on this project together. And I'll let you tell them about their friendship as well, which is one of the reasons I'm glad they're here. So yeah, this is interesting stuff, and I think the moral of this story is pay attention to it and make sure you get it right, and that you talk about it explicitly and you read some stories of how others have done it. All right, so in addition to the family dynamics thing, or whether you're friends, here's a simple math quiz, since we're dealing with a number of math whizzes. Which of these is a better number? 100% of 5 million or 5% of 100 million? And it's obviously a trick question. There's no right answer. But I'll bet some of you have a guess. And the moral of this story is that some people feel better just seeing everything in front of them, knowing this is my little thing. This is my $5 million right here. It's only $5 million, which is plenty, and that's fine. Whereas some people say, oh, $100 million, that's a much bigger number than 5 million. That looks more interesting. And even if I only have 5% of it, that's still pretty cool. I'd rather go that route. And that is the language that Wasserman has nicknamed rich or king, which is to say, would you rather own all of something small or a little of something big? If you'd rather own all of something small, you are a king, if you will. You want to be in charge, or a queen. I think he changed it to royal because he got in trouble from some women who said he shouldn't just call it king. So I think he now calls it rich or royal. But rich or king is what he mostly got known writing about. If you're a king and you want to be in control and you want to be the #1 dude in this company, the argument is that in most cases you're going to wind up being king of a small island. That if you really want to grow something amazing and have a huge organization and lots of customers and lots of support and lots of distribution channels, you're probably going to have to give up a lot to partners. And there are a few charismatic leaders we think about, like Jeff Bezos, and maybe Bill Gates, or maybe Zuckerman, or maybe Drew Houston and Dropbox, who managed to be both the king of their venture and also made it very successful. But I've just named 5 or 6 people. You'd probably name another 5, and then you'd run out of names pretty quickly. If you name starting technical founders who built some amazingly large enterprise and are still running it and are still king of it, there's 7 billion people on Earth, and you probably can't name more than 5 or 10 who pulled that off. That would suggest that this path of being both rich and king is probably not the one for you. I mean, it might be worth a shot if you could figure it out. But when you ask people in a survey, a typical class of students, you get about a 60-40 split. And obviously, I also take issue a little bit with this axis about financial gain, because some people are doing this for the betterment of humanity, and they don't care if they make a lot of money doing it. So you could replace the word financial with some other descriptor of what you think the benefit of your company is. But whether you have tight control over it or whether you have low or high gains, you kind of want to pick where you are in this continuum. Most people, of course, argue that they want to be in the upper right box, and you kind of have to talk them out of that and say that's kind of delusional. And you want to know with your co-founders which are you, because you can have a lot of debates about which way the company is going to go based on whether you've got the right combination of these people in your company. And by the way, if you look at the value of the share of value that founders hold on to as they progress, again, in this set of venture-backed startups that Wasserman studied, those who gave up both the CEO position and board control wound up with a higher percentage of the financial value, and it keeps going down as you go in terms of what the actual dollar worth of their holdings in the company was worth. So again, it was better to have 5% of 100 million than 100% of 5 million, because the number got bigger. It wasn't just 5 million. And that these dilemmas occur at numerous points in the journey. You kind of have to think about this even before you started the company. When to found, some people might want to start companies for different reasons. Some people want to stay in school the whole time. Someone might want to drop out and start it immediately. There might be differences of opinions and motivations for why you would want to do one versus the other. As you build the team, as you hire more, as you take on venture capital or other investors, at each of these junctures, these differences in team members are going to emerge. And so having a good lens into how people operate and how you resolve differences is a good thing to have. I'll close by showing you this little eye chart here. And he did this research just based on men and women, which is a pretty coarse and arbitrary distinction. The idea is not so much so you learn something about men and women, and also entrepreneurs and non-entrepreneurs, but that you could take any two personality traits. You could take nationality or age or where someone was educated or what they like to eat for breakfast, whatever. That if you take a room of human beings, there are going to be different types of human beings. Gender is one of the most trivial ones to measure in a research study, so he did it with men and women and talked to them about their objectives and what they wanted to do in their companies, and came up with these rankings. And again, these are interesting conversations to have with your co-founders when you start out. So that's a quick intro. I said I want to spend most of the time having you interview our student panel about this. So I think at this point I might ask our friends to come up. You'll notice I have 3 bullet items but 4 humans. That's because Catherine and Robert are a team. They're the ones who met. They're going to sit on the end here. They're the ones who met in my seminar 4 years ago and have been working together on a couple of companies since then. And then Ashwin and Trang will take their seats as well. And maybe we will, so come on up, and why don't you join me in welcoming our subjects. And I'm going to let them talk mostly for a few minutes each, and then we'll have some open Q&A, and I'll ask them. And I don't know if you guys can see the screen now that I've asked you to sit down here. I had emailed you these questions earlier too. But I want this mostly, you should give a brief elevator pitch about what your company is, just to set context, and if you want to say a little something about your background and where you grew up or why you're at MIT, that'd be great. But mostly I want this to be about the founding team dynamics and how you chose your founders. What's the culture and vibe of your company? What's it like when you work together? We all have a sense of a feeling of what it's like to do business with a company, or even when you walk into a store, walking into a Starbucks feels different than walking into a Dunkin' Donuts. Like, why is that? Is it because of the paint? Do the people act different? Like, what's it like to be in your coffee shop, if you will? What's your vibe in your culture? When and how do you either agree or argue with your co-founders, and how do you figure that stuff out? Who's in charge? Who's the tiebreaker, or do you flip coins? And then you could reflect on Wasserman's 3 R's, if you will, the relationship, roles, and rewards, and how you figure out who does what, who has what title, and what relationships you've had with your co-founders over the year. So maybe we'll just start with Trang, who I actually met first from this group. Trang was in my freshman seminar 4 years ago, so that seems like a suitable way to start. So Trang, take it away.
Perfect. So I'm part of Ancora, and we're building a wristband that reduces tremors for patients who have Parkinson's disease or essential tremors.
Do you want to pull that mic a little closer to you?
Did everybody hear me? Should I repeat that? So we're building a wristband that reduces tremors for patients who have Parkinson's disease or essential tremors.
Good. And how'd you meet your co-founders?
So the project started as a 2009 capstone project. So I did my undergraduate here at MIT. And as seniors, mechanical engineers, you all have to take like this big capstone project. So the class started with 100 different people divided up into like 6 teams. And within like my team, there were 17 people. And then once the class finished, we had this alpha prototype. And then the question became, who wants to continue this as a startup? And then I think that's when we divided up who wants to continue and make this into a company. And the biggest main motivation factor for that was the mission, because the test patient that we were testing with, it was just hard to like help him take away his tremors and then not continue with a technology that can change someone's life. And it was just really hard for like the 5 of us to walk away with that, especially since we feel such a responsibility to use our education, our privilege, our influence to do something past just have this degree for like showing off. And I think that was the main motivation of how we formed the company.
You went from 17 to 5, because if you ever take 2009 here, the teams are huge.
Mm-hmm.
Was that a natural selection of those 5?
I think so. At first, there were a couple of like people who just wanted to jump on a bandwagon. But then as the spring semester went by and then people got jobs and different priority changes, and then over the summer, there was only about 6, 7 left. And then near the end, when we were thinking about incorporating, the conversation became really serious about who is going to split the equity between us and who is going to put in the work. And we actually had some tough conversation about people and asked them like specifically, what do you plan to bring to the company if you decide to stay? And we all had to go through that.
All right, let's go down the line. I have a bunch more questions for you, and I'm sure everyone, but let's get everyone to say hi. And Ashwin is the student who actually took this program 3 years ago, so take it away.
Hey, so my name's Ashwin, and I'm a PhD student here, finishing up in the next year or so. And I'm working on a company called Indicator with 4 other people, split between here and the West Coast. So what we're trying to do is improve the decision-making process for deciding which drugs to develop or invest in for biotech companies and biotech investors. The essential problem is that there's around 10,000 diseases, and most people are not aware of all of those and don't have complete information on what they are scientifically or what it means to actually treat one of these patients. So we're trying to bring together the information in one very clean search engine type database and get it into the hands of the decision makers in the industry. So we got motivated to work on this problem, in part because our team is comprised of a couple of med students, so they actually see some of these extremely rare diseases and they have to tell patients like, no one knows about this disease, there is no cure, and no one's working on a cure, and that's pretty hard to do. And then on the flip side, a couple of us have had experiences with the biotech industry, either working at biotech startups or investing in them, and we've seen the inefficiencies in this process. So we bring together our technical skills as well as medical backgrounds. It was a clear fit. We knew that we could build something here, and we knew that it would provide value both to patients and to people in the industry.
And that group, your initial core group, was it obvious kind of from day one that you were going to do this together, or was there much shopping for co-founders?
Yeah, so we got started just toying with this idea about 14 months ago, so end of 2017. And at first, we thought it would be fun to just get on our computers and hack something together as a tool for one of our co-founders to use at work. She's a biotech investor. And a couple of months later, it became clear there's a business opportunity here. And then so we grew the team to include a few more people with a medical background and actually started laying the groundwork for building a product we could sell. The team met through all sorts of interesting connections. But so 3 of us are part of the same graduate fellowship program. So we meet every year or twice a year at conferences. And so we've known each other since 2014 and just built this friendship, really, of understanding how important things like automated automated systems can be, how powerful machine learning is, learning about biotech from each other. And so when we all noticed this problem, it was clear who in this group would want to work on this. And so it was really easy to just all get together on the phone and say, we should do this together. And then the 2 medical students we brought in, actually one of them goes way back with one of our co-founders all the way to undergrad. So it's really nice to see a group of friends getting together and then starting to work as business partners.
Nice. So Robert or Catherine, I don't know which of you wants to speak first.
I can start first. So we originally met, as Ken Zolot mentioned, in the Founder's Journey class. And so we started working on lots of projects throughout our undergrad. And so the fall of our sophomore year, we had this crazy idea to build a boba machine in our dorm. And so we set about building this machine, had it finished in a month, and had it running on the first floor of the east parallel of East Campus. And so we did so well, just selling tons of boba. Boba, by the way, is a milk tea drink. It has tapioca pearls in it, and it's really trendy. And so our numbers were great. We applied really late to Y Combinator and managed to get in, and then we spent the semester after that in San Francisco. Keep going.
Oh, so Robert and I met in Founder's Journey, but I feel like our relationship was established through doing lots of projects together. Before we worked on the boba machine, we actually did 7 hackathons together, and we won multiple prizes. So at that point, we got really good at making prototypes and just building things really quickly. Often for the hackathons, you only have, 24 hours to build them. That's why we were able to get it quickly and develop a working relationship. We also worked with another friend, Jingwei, who was not able to go to Y Combinator with us because she's an international student. And Jingwei also worked on multiple hackathon projects with us. So because our relationship had been established over multiple hackathons, it was pretty easy dividing up the roles, working together, and communicating in a transparent way.
And you both lived in East Campus, right?
Yeah, all 3 of us lived in East Campus.
And then you obviously moved out to California together for Y Combinator, and so you've kind of been living in the same spot for several years as well.
Yeah, we have a lot of fun stories from living in San Francisco. If anyone has ever been there, you know it's kind of weird. The first 3 months we lived in a basement, and it's because it was the fastest housing we could get from Craigslist. Yeah, we spent 8 months in San Francisco. We pivoted to a couple other projects, multiple projects which are still running, and we decided to come back to school because it was a hard decision, but we weren't really prepared to drop out because MIT is a nice place, believe it or not. Yeah, so right now we're filing our taxes for the first time. That's fun.
And where do you live now?
We're still in East Campus.
Oh, cool. And you heard Robert tell that story. I just want to emphasize this. They were freshmen and just kind of having fun with this project. It might have been sophomore year when it launched. They just enjoyed drinking boba tea and said, let's make a machine and put it in the dorm. They had a going business right there in their hallway in East Campus.
So a funny detail is the machine that we built was a repurposed mini fridge with some pumps and holes drilled in it with a tablet that you can order. So it was very as makeshift as a startup could be. And I think the reason why we were able to keep going with it was the irony and the humor of it all was like too good to pass up on. That kind of bounded us together.
So let's dive into some of the deeper topics of how your founding teams have come together. I'll flip back to this slides. You talked a bit about the origin already. In terms of your culture and vibe, and you guys could start since you just talked, do you have a sense of what it's like to be working together and with each other and what your company feels like? You know, if your company were a color, what color would it be? If it were an animal, what animal would it be? I'm kind of just provoking you with goofy questions. What's it feel like to be part of your team? If I wanted to join you, what sort of energy would I bring to it?
Okay, so for us, you know, it was really early and it was just the 2 of us, so that definitely influences the culture a lot. But I'd say, you know, we're very whimsical. I mean, if you're going to just, you know, if you're going to go out to, if you're going to fly out to San Francisco to build a boba machine, you have to be like incredibly like whimsical. I literally just told my parents, hey, I'm like dropping out and gonna just fly to San Francisco. Some weird people gave me money, and I'm building this machine that makes a drink you've never heard of. And so, yeah, we just kind of roll with the flow. And I guess if we were an animal, we'd be a naked mole rat.
And do you have artifacts that you, like some companies, you walk in their lobby and you see things, or like Google has notoriously very goofy decorations in their office space. Are there ways you project the company culture either with artifacts or maybe with rituals? Like, do you meet for pizza every Friday at noon, or do you have some routine that you all do?
Well, yeah, I guess we used to go to a boba shop to do our work called Plenty in San Francisco. We don't have specific rituals because it's just the two of us, and we spend a lot of time together. So, to add to Robert's point about what like unites us culturally, I would like to add that dark humor is also a big thing with us. We like to just kind of make jokes out of every situation, and it makes stuff a lot lighter, it makes things less stressful, and it keeps us going.
And if you grew to 100 people and you were just 2% of the company instead of 100%, what would you want to see in those other people? How would you make sure, it might just happen by accident, by osmosis, just by them being near you, or could you take explicit steps to make sure the culture of the place was what you wanted?
I think if we narrowed it down, it'd be one, they should have a strong sense of humor, and two, be focused. So I think that a lot of people value like intelligence or other traits, but I think focus is very important because if you have strong focus and you have a lot of grit, you just keep going at it, you're eventually going to get it.
Good. Ashwin, do you want to comment on that? What's the culture like
Sure,
for you?
yeah. So when we all got started, we were all working part-time, and actually all of us are still doing so. So a big part of our culture was trying to find a way to maintain momentum and keep moving forward despite having conflicting obligations. I know that's not a fun answer, but I think the big part of our culture is accountability. We don't really have time to manage each other or have a project manager. So essentially, if someone says they're going to do something, they do it by the next meeting, and it just gets integrated into the product, and there's no one who has to check to see if they've done it. And we didn't have that at first, but we recognized that if we could do that, it would just speed things up quite a bit. And it's been awesome to see how fast we've moved now that that's just a built-in assumption. One thing that the group likes to do for fun when good things happen, like beta testers give us good feedback, is go and get wheatgrass shots.
Go and get what?
Wheatgrass.
Ah.
Very California of them. And I think our team mascot might be AV issues. Half the team's in Boston, half the team's in California, and we are just never able to get a good Skype connection.
Huh. You made an interesting point when you said that you're all doing other things in addition to founding this company. And that's probably true of pretty much everyone here because you're all students as well. It occurs to me to call that out as an important thing. There's a point at which, and this goes back to Wasserman's slide, which I'll show you, the decision about when to found. So, and in some sense, everyone here is on the far left of this, or figuring out when they get from the far left to pulling the trigger and diving in full time. Especially when you're here as students and working with classmates or roommates or friends, you can goof around with ideas for a long time. At some point, someone's going to have to say, hey, are we in this or not? You know, are we really going to do this? Are we going to graduate? Or are we going to run this company full time? Are we going to put the company on hold until we graduate? Then the minute we graduate, we're all going to dive in full time. So until you've done that, figuring out that process and being transparent with each other about how that process is going to work is a key part of this as well. And I think you've all been navigating that.
Yeah, one thing that we found helped resolve this tension of who is giving credit for what, who is going to be awarded what amount of equity, is using something called a dynamic equity split. I don't know, are you guys talking about that in this class?
Have you gotten into that yet?
Yeah, this is the slicing the pie?
Yeah, that's exactly the book I was going to say has saved us. And everyone should read it.
I'd be curious to hear how that's actually worked.
So, okay, we're not following, well, okay, so as a bit of background, the idea is that people aren't given equity from a top-down model of you're a founder, you get a third. It's more of what are you bringing to the table, how much time are you putting in, what like features have you built, what customers are you onboarding? And then you can assign a value to those actions, and then you can basically compare everyone's contributions to the company. And we've found we had to do something like this because people's commitments fluctuated throughout the semester depending on what rotation they were on, where they were on vacation. And so we're not following the book's template like to the I don't know, to the number, because it's maybe a little bit too nuanced for us. But what we're trying to do is give people credit when they're going above and beyond, and also recognizing when someone may be taking a break, and that's okay.
I'll post that as materials for the class.
Yeah, slicing the pie. And the whole issue of equity splits, I mean, that's a huge, I think there are semester-long courses at Sloan about this. And that also goes to the friendship issue as well. Like if Joe and I were going to start a company, you know, I don't want to put Joe on the spot and we don't want to have to argue about this. How about we just become 50-50 partners and we'll start a company. And then an hour from now, after we've signed the papers and I own 50% of the company, I say, oh, Joe, I was only kidding. I'm moving to Tahiti. Good luck running that company. Remember, I still own 50%, and just send the checks to Tahiti when you make money for me. That wouldn't be a very equitable arrangement. And Joe probably knows better than to sign such an agreement with me. So what Ashwin was talking about and what this book talks about is ways to figure out who's going to own how much of the company based on who does what over time. But the way you put that algorithm in place can define the culture as well. The way you kind of deal with money as a trading issue between co-founders. You know, maybe I want to have such a harmonious relationship with Joe that I'm okay giving him 50% even if he moves to Tahiti. We've known each other long enough. We'll make it up to each other eventually, and I'm willing to wing it because I don't want to have this adversarial notion of me clocking every one of his hours to figure out if he's earned his equity. And that sort of sets a tone for the company as well. So it's interesting that every decision you make early on is going to kind of create the vibe, which is why I'm glad this topic came up. Yes, question?
When you distribute equity like that, is this like an elastic model? Like do you revisit it, or do you sort of commit to the responsibilities that you've had when you distributed it?
Yeah, and that's what this book is getting at to, this performance-based allocation. It's elastic in that the equity is not distributed on day one, but you have conditions under which equity will be distributed in the future. The traditional way to do it was just time-based vesting, that if you just stuck around long enough, you would earn more stock in the company and you would own more of it. There are now tricky ways of assigning it based on how much value you actually deliver. That gets really tricky, and there are nasty fights that go on about this. If you saw the movie The Social Network or know the story of the Winklevoss versus Zuckerberg debate, I mean, especially once the thing gets big and valuable. So to have some of these things vague can invite trouble later. Sometimes it's better to nail it down early so no one can claim that they did more work than you think they did. But it's really hard to get right. There are also tax implications because you want to take ownership of your equity in the company when the company's not worth that much. Because if all of a sudden, if someone gave me 1,000 shares of Apple today, I'd all of a sudden have all this money that I'd have to account for to the IRS. Was that a gift, or was it salary, or how did I get that all of a sudden? Whereas if someone gave me 1,000 shares of something that was worth zero, that's a much more trivial thing to account for. So figuring out when you're actually going to do the transfer of ownership with respect to the ownership value of the company is a tricky thing from an accounting standpoint as well. I should stop talking about that because I could go on for hours about it. And as I said, there are some really good courses at Sloan and experts on this that go into this in depth. But it's an important thing to sort out. And I'm glad you mentioned that model you're using. So Trang, tell us about your culture and your vibe.
I think the mission that unites us together at first really dictates the culture. So it's rooted in like caring and trusting each other. But then it's because we're developing a product that's for serious conditions. But outside of that, like whenever we go like test with patient, it's never like serious. It's always like light, happy-go-lucky. We're laughing and joking as we're like testing with our patient and making sure that they feel comfortable. Because oftentimes you will find like people who have Parkinson's now tend to be older and they have all these interesting stories and they want to give us candy. It's always fun. And then outside of us working, it's just like we roast each other all the time. Because like we're all like around 23, 22. Like a fun example is when we were renaming ourselves, because we used to be named Animal, and now we're named Ancora. But one of the suggestions was like quiescent, and then I was like, I can't pronounce that. Like I can't. I'm gonna quit the team. Like if we name it that. And it was just and we had Thanksgiving together as well. Not the actual day, but like 2 weeks before, and we were like, this is gonna be an annual company holiday in the future as well. It's like November 15th.
So you've got your own non-Thanksgiving, like your a Festivus holiday of sorts. It's your own invented holiday.
Yeah.
That's a great ritual. And you mentioned naming, by the way, which I didn't talk about either. But in terms of defining the culture and the vibe of the company, you'd be surprised at what naming and logo design and color design for your business cards. Those could be some heated wars amongst founders, and it's really hard to get that right. So it sounds like you just settled on that recently.
Yeah, so it was about 2-3 months ago, and we just like bought some beers and like food, and we all sat in a room for like 4 hours, and we were like, we're not leaving until we come up with a name. And then that was like the criteria, and then we came in with like a bunch of suggestions, and then one of them is the second runner-up was Shaky No-No.
Shaky no-no
yeah,
to reduce
shaky
shaking
no-no.
in Parkinson's patients?
Yeah, Shaky No-No versus Ancora, and we were like, okay, let's vote. But it's really fun. Like, I have a blast. Like, one of my friends, so as a grad student, I've noticed that it's less social than undergrad. So I was telling my friends, like, oh, you should just start a company. That's like built-in friends that you have to hang out with each other all the time.
So yeah, this question of whether you're founding with friends, you're saying that once you found, you'll have no choice but to become friends if the team's going to work.
Yeah, and it's like a baseline of like respect and trust as well.
So let's move to the question of arguing with each other, as long as we're talking about respect and trust. And arguing can be a good thing too, like when you're brainstorming and one of you only has half the solution and you want the other one to come up with the other half. There's sort of positive arguing, if you will, of trying to coax someone into finishing your sentence for you when you can't finish it yourself. Or there's adversarial arguing where you're convinced you know the way to do it and your co-founder or partner thinks they know the opposite way. How does that work in your team?
I think all of our argument is based off of logic and like reason, and all of us is motivated not by anything else but like to get as much impact as possible and get a solution on the hands of as many Parkinson patients as possible. So every decision we make, whether it's accept an investor money or go FDA or not, or go direct to consumer, it's all just how much impact can we make on this route.
So does logic always work? Do you ever get to a point where you say, I'm tired of arguing with you, I just know I'm right, trust me, I believe this, you have to trust my gut?
I don't think we've ever been to that point, but I feel like important thing is that we make sure that each point is heard. Like we always like let the person who strongly feels something speak their mind, and then we like try to dissect why they think that way. So maybe it's not always logical, because maybe the problem isn't always logical. Like, for example, when we were first starting out, because we were all engineers, we didn't know like any business thing and who to trust. So we had like people approach us to try to be like our mentors and split equity with us. And then at that point, it was just like based on gut feelings of like, do we trust this person or something feels off?
Yeah, that's a great point. We've been talking about the core founding team now, but almost every founding team has an extended network of advisors or even, aunts and uncles who want to give you advice about it, or people you might meet through VMS or other organizations at MIT, Venture Mentoring Service, who want to come in as occasional visitors or advisors. And do you pay them, or do you give them equity, or are they just doing it out of the goodness of their heart, or because they're related to you? And what's sort of the deal you're making with them, and what are their motivations as well? And I also like that when you were talking about the vibe of your company, you're dealing directly with other human beings as your patients or customers. I mean, some services you just put up a website, and like I was talking about Stripe earlier, even though they do business development occasionally with partners, most of their transactions are just happening over bits over the wire, and they actually rarely see a human being they're interacting with, versus very direct hands-on work with patients who you have to have some sort of rapport with. And just the notion of whether you would call yourself shaky no-no, which is, as you said, you want to approach this difficult situation with the patient in a whimsical way, and how that can kind of cut down the anxiety a little bit. Is that something you want to explicitly put in your name? You clearly chose not to do that.
No, it was. I think it was definitely a joke when it was suggested.
So Ashwin, how do you guys egg each other on or argue with each other or make the most of your similarities and differences?
All right. So I guess the first thing, as I mentioned, is our team is largely comprised of people with an engineering, scientific, or medical, clinical background. So we're all used to parsing through data. So just like Trong said, we try to boil things down to like the objective. And we also have kind of come up with a few metrics to guide us when we're doing this, because it's not always a clear-cut answer. So we read this book called Measure What Matters, and I guess this idea transcends the book. It's just come up with a few metrics for your business that matter the most. And for us, it's feedback from beta testers, or like the rate that features of a certain kind are developed and tested. And so we can always boil back conflicts back to how does that help us reach those goals that we've all agreed upon. So since we've already had the more controversial conversation on what our priorities are, anything that has to do with reaching those can kind of fit into this framework, and then it's usually non-controversial. But when we do have conflicts, one thing that I've learned from one of my co-founders is a really elegant way of phrasing something that could be controversial, which is basically, I feel like X about this, but I could be convinced otherwise. And that kind of opens the door up to criticism and feedback, while also putting your foot down and saying, this is how I feel about something. And it's really helped us guide discussions in a constructive way.
Just the words "I feel" is the beginning. If you read books like from marriage counselors or how to get along with people, it's always, you don't say you're an idiot, you say I feel like you're acting in an idiotic way. And that's a nicer way to deliver the message, that it's my problem and not yours, even though often it's the same message. But having the nuance to understand that and frame it as how somebody's actions are affecting you and why they're ringing true to you. And by the way, I should say that when we talk about decision making, and the more formal business word for this is governance, there's both the internal team cultural methodology, but there's also accountability to investors and shareholders and just corporate law. I mean, most standard C corporations in the US, you have to have a president, a treasurer, and a secretary that has very specific obligations. They can all be the same person, but there are some very specific things by law that different officers of the company are on the hook for and could even be held criminally liable for if things go south or if there's fraud or something else wrong with the company. So you need to think about this stuff both from sort of a personal dynamic standpoint, but also from a who owns what titles in the eyes of the law or in the eyes of customers. Some customers say, well, I want to talk to the CEO. I want to talk to the person with decision-making authority. Let me speak to your manager about this. You know, I want to talk to somebody with more authority. And who do you put forward in the company when a customer wants to see that? And that's the allocation of titles is a big debate in lots of startups as well. So Robert and Catherine, do you want to talk about your methods for getting good ideas from each other or beating bad ideas out of each other?
So I actually think that the psychology of doing a startup is very different from running a business later, in that there isn't like a very solid methodology that's a one-size-fits-all for everyone. A good friend who sold 2 companies and is currently working on his 3rd startup said that running a startup is like being a pirate. You're going around, you don't know what's going on. It's an adventure, and given that like analogy, it's like you can't really write a list of 10 guidelines for the pirate to follow in order for him to find gold. Like what you do is you have a rapid feedback cycle, which in the case of the pirate is like, okay, I'm doing X, Y, and Z. This is what's going on. Maybe I should change my navigation, or maybe I should do this differently. And based on these rapid observation feedback cycles, you change your way of navigating accordingly. So in that context, there's certain qualities that are very useful for running startups, like being observant, being extremely flexible, being open-minded, being able to find insight, being able to see what people want or need, and just having enough flexibility to change directions really quickly. And also, so we were starting this financial documents project, and in the beginning, I was trying to build basically the replica of something that already exists that is making a lot of money. And then after I build the replica, add the features. But instead of doing that, I actually should have just taken the features, made the shittiest website, put it out there, see how many customers use it, and iterate. Because believe it or not, the biggest companies right now, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, whatever, they did not start that way. The first prototype was probably really jank. And only by making really jank things can you very quickly determine whether or not people actually want them. Because it's really hard, especially being in a university setting or going to school for 12 years straight, to know what people in the real world actually want. So it's kind of like you're throwing stuff at a wall and seeing what sticks.
Yeah, I think it might have been Reid Hoffman, a founder of LinkedIn, who quoted or coined the phrase, if your first product doesn't suck, then you waited too long to release it. Which, again, in an early stage when you're just building something and trying to get customer validation and you don't have that much reputation at stake, is a good, like you said, it's really important to understand what phase you're at. If you're Boeing rolling out an aircraft, you don't want to say, well, we'll crash the first 10 of them and we'll kill a bunch of people, it doesn't matter. You can't get away with that in certain areas.
Well, to add to that, so the I forget what their names are, but the two people that built the first airplane.
Wright brothers?
Yeah, exactly, the Wright brothers. Mm-hmm. So the reason why their prototype worked is what they did differently from everyone else was they built a wind tunnel. So using the wind tunnel, they built a lot of really shitty prototypes in the wind tunnel to test what shape actually flew, after which they built their actual plane.
That's a great metaphor. So your challenge is to create wind tunnels, if you will, in which you could test these things out.
Yeah, the key is to test things out really, really quickly.
Robert, on founding teams dynamics and how you argue, maybe this is putting you on the spot, asking you a personal question. What do you think is your character trait that most drives Catherine crazy? When she's mad at you, why is that?
You're mad at me.
She's never mad at you?
No. Yeah, I think what balances our dynamic really well is that Catherine gets really anxious and stressed out about things, and I'm really calm. I'm sometimes too calm, and so we balance each other out and give perspective for things. I think we resolve a lot of our conflicts by just giving the other person the space to try things out, to build that first crappy prototype to see where it can go. I remember when we were in San Francisco, we just cut the boba machine. We're looking at a few different ideas, and Catherine had this idea of building a direct Facebook clone. It would have the same features as Facebook, just it would be less shitty than Facebook. It's literally Facebook.
I hope you're still working on that, by the way.
Yeah. And it's just everyone's going to use it. People are just going to drop Facebook. It's going to be the next Facebook. It's that simple, right? And so as we talked to our mentors, and no one was really that enthusiastic, but the key is I had the faith in Catherine to try that out. She had some time to try it out, see where the feelings were. And while she worked on it, she had this wonderful financial documents idea that she's been working on since. And so I think you just need to believe in people in order to move forward.
Well, let's open it up to the audience and get some other folks to ask questions. Joe, you want us to break for stretch at 7:25, is that right?
Yeah, that would work.
Okay, good. So let's open it up for discussion. Or anyone got any ideas or want to be co-founders with one of these people? Or is their idea resonate? Anyone working on anything similar?
Wondering if you can comment on the transition between the academic studies and what you might consider the real world. It's great to exist in where you are, and at some point you feel like you have to almost pull the plug and eject yourself into the real world.
Yeah, I'll just repeat that. I don't know if there are people watching live or if we're recording this for posterity, but we have microphones up here. The transition between academic life and the real world, if you will, the difference between being a student and actually running a going commercial venture.
So in the real world, it's all about the customers. Like some people say, "Oh, I want to do a startup because I want freedom." That's bullshit. When you do a startup, your customers are your boss. Like you want to please your customers. You want to figure out what they want, and it's most important to build what they want. So what's different about this between this and academia? In academia, this is arguable, but I would say the biggest reason people are doing academia is to uncover knowledge, right? You're pushing the boundaries of what we know, whether it's through engineering or science or whatever. In the real world, it's all about your customers. So the approach is very different. For example, in academia, you might read a lot of papers, and by exposing yourself to lots of knowledge, synthesizing this information, drawing analogies, you might be able to make a breakthrough. In the real world, you want to be pushing things out as quickly as you can to get feedback because you're serving customers and you just have no idea what they want. There are a lot of people out there and some of them want really weird things.
Yeah, to add a little bit on that, if you see a lot of companies that follow trends, it's like, for example, like a blockchain startup or like a machine learning startup. A lot of these companies aren't even necessarily what the person has wanted to do their whole life. Like I wanted to do a marijuana startup. A lot of them pick ideas that allow them to get funding, and so your level of freedom is kind of restricted. You can't just come up with a company for anything you want, get funding, and then all the customers will like it. You need to create a company that investors will believe in and that customers will like, and so your freedom is more constrained than it might seem.
If we were to abstract it to a certain level, it's just like the real world versus doing academia is starting a company has different constraints. Like, for example, a company is ultimately a money printing machine. Like, regardless of what people tell you, I guess if you have a nonprofit, sure, it doesn't have to make money. But otherwise, you have to make money. You can raise a lot of money, be losing money, but eventually you have to make money. So where are there people willing to pay for something? How much are they willing to pay? And is this enough to sustain whatever you're building? These are questions that are completely different from academia because you never have to consider it.
And then just to add to that, in academia, we get funding like scholarships, NSF to pay for like your housing and food. Outside of academia, because we have a full-time employee right now, she dog walks in her free time as you work on this project full-time. So there's a lot of like financial means that comes in reality. Like people need to eat, people need to sleep, people need to have a place where they can stay dry in the rain. So that's another constraint after you leave school, if you're working this full-time.
I'll start with saying I'm in no way qualified to talk about the real world, but as we're on the cusp of a couple of us graduating soon, we've been realizing that our freedom probably is going to be a lot more constrained, and our sense of urgency to make this thing fly is going to be a lot higher than it is right now when all of us are students and have our cost of living at least taken care of. And in talking with potential customers who are all in industry and have been there for a little while, it seems like they get to the point a little bit faster than people in academia and in research do. I think that's motivating because it helps you just cut through to the clear point you're trying to get at, but sometimes it's less fun, I feel. So I'm not sure how I'm gonna feel once I'm there.
And I'll point out that and as an encouragement for you folks to make the most of being on campus, the camaraderie and approachability of your peers is something that I think that you don't realize until it's gone. Like if you walked through the financial district in Boston and you wanted to start a fintech company and you wanted to go talk to people who worked at Fidelity or State Street or one of these big companies, and you walked down the street past one of these giant office buildings and walked in, there'd be a security guard there saying, well, who are you and what do you want? And you'd say, I don't know, I just want to hang out and talk to some people who work here. They'd get somebody with a net to take you out of the building. Versus you could walk around the halls here and do that and make good friends and ask people direct personal questions about what they're working on or what makes them happy and all kinds of topics, that there's sort of an automatic icebreaker, whereas getting strangers in the quote real world to give you the time of day or to agree to have a meeting with you is a ton of work. And it's what a lot of companies spend a lot of time doing, building business relationships and schmoozing people and figuring out how to talk to colleagues. So the ability to just have that free flow of social interaction here is a wonderful thing about being not in the real world, if you will. So I saw a bunch of hands. Yes, up there.
Hi, thank you guys so much for sharing your experiences. I have a question about like the growth phase. If you guys feel like you could have taken on more money at some point, taken on more people who have more expertise, and grown the company faster. Because at the end of the day, all of us here, we start our own businesses are limited by our own capacity. So, what are the trade-offs that you see with taking on maybe certain VCs with that expertise or more money? Obviously, it's equity, but what was your decision-making process in how fast to grow, i.e., exchange of resources for equity?
Yeah, and I'll just paraphrase for the video recording. As you grow, how do you decide how quick to grow, when to take on new partners, when to take on new capital, or when, and this gets back to some extent to the rich or king thing. Would you rather be king of your own controllable islands, or do you want to let this thing spiral potentially out of control and take on others? And how do you resolve questions about how quickly to grow and when to take on more investors or more co-founders? Or when you're in over your head and you need to bring in somebody else who can help you?
So the approach we've taken to that, granted we've had the luxury of all starting while we're in school, so we don't need money right now, is we're trying to use our runway period to understand what product to build. So we're still in the research phase, I would say. We may start selling something sometime this year, but that's really not the priority. We're still trying to build a product that we can get into the hands of customers and to get feedback so that when we do start building, we're confident they'll buy it. And once we get to that point, then we'll be at that inflection point, if you will, where we know what we would do with more money, hire more engineers, hire a competent sales team. But we're definitely kind of laying low and keeping things small and within our control right now as we answer these questions, because we don't want to have to scale any earlier than we need to.
You go.
Sweet. Yeah, I just wanted to quickly touch on that. For us, in our specific case, we determined we didn't want to grow any further because we cut the boba machine and then pivoted to a much smaller scope of an idea, which became kind of like a lifestyle business before, while also looking at other ideas. And so, yeah, Catherine has to start.
So to preface the answer, I want to give 2 examples. One is a company called Homejoy. You might have heard of it. They're basically Uber for cleaning services. They raised a lot of money, I think 50 million. They burned a lot of cash, but they ultimately went down. Why? Because they didn't actually prove that their idea worked before they invested a lot of money into it. And the idea being that you hire maids through their service and their contractors. Another example is there was something from the late 90s called the ITV, and it's basically interactive television, which Netflix is actually doing a really great job of now. But back then, lots of different production companies pooled billions of dollars into that. It was worked on by Jim Clark, who founded Netscape, but it also ultimately went down because people didn't actually want it. So to answer that question, it depends on what phase of your startup you're in. If you're in the phase where you're determining whether or not the market actually wants your idea, you probably shouldn't raise that much money, and you probably shouldn't burn that much money if possible, unless it's a hardware startup, in which case it's really risky. Once you have a proof of concept and you're gaining customers, you have momentum, that's when it's usually a good idea to raise money, because you can spread it faster through buying more ads. Basically, the rolling out phase requires more money to gain traction.
Something that was recommended to us when we were thinking about raising money and growing was you raise money based on what milestone you want to accomplish. So if you need this amount of money to reach so many products, then that's how much you would raise. And then another thing is MIT has a lot of resources that's equity-free money, like Sandbox, the Legatum. There's just so much free resources that you should take advantage of now before you raise money from Dorm Room Fund or Rough Draft or any other VCs.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I don't know if you've already directed them, Joe, to the Innovation Initiatives website. There's a group here that has attempted to pool all of the various resources on campus that are available to startup founders. Trang mentioned a couple of them, the Sandbox Fund, the Legatum Center. There are like 50. One of the good news and bad news about being at MIT is if you ask 10 people who's in charge of entrepreneurship, you'll get 11 answers. That there are places all over the place that are kind of nibbling away at this. And there's a wonderful collection of resources so that you don't have to jump out into the real world and start growing real fast right away.
Oh, can I also add that there's like pitch competition, like a 100K pitch, and then like the Vice Business Plan, like the Alpha Hardware Cup. There's just so much like free money. If you like actively look, you will find it.
And on the subject of venture capital and this issue of how fast to grow and when to scale, one of the problems with taking venture capital is that you're sort of getting locked onto a freight train that they've defined. They've made promises to their investors. They need to hit grand slams and get companies to become billion-dollar companies within a certain number of years, and they'll almost always pressure you to go big or go bust. Whereas you might be willing to run a small lifestyle company that's never going to be a billion-dollar company, but might make you and your co-founder very happy and pay you just enough to pay your rent and buy some food, which might be all you want. But that's never something that a venture capitalist would want. So figuring out how fast you want your own rewards from the company to grow is another important thing about that. I saw a bunch of other hands, other questions? Yep.
I was wondering when I can buy a shaky no-no. Can you put in perspective how far along your ventures are? Do any of you sell stuff to customers already? To what extent are things happening?
Yeah, good question. I'll just repeat it for the remote audience. When can you actually buy something? In your case, when can a customer buy a shaky no-no? In the rest of your cases, do you actually have live customers buying real products now? Or are you still in the validation phase?
Right, so by the end of February, we will have 20 beta prototypes that we're gonna select 20 like participant to like help us inform like the algorithm and also like the mechanical design. And then after that, we're going to hopefully build up 500 devices. If you go to our website, it's incoratherapeutics.com. You can like leave your thing, we'll add you to the mailing list. But thank you for asking.
So we have gotten our first beta product into the hands of customers, and that was for free. They didn't have to pay. And we're currently using that feedback to build what we're calling our Generation 1 product, and we're planning to have it ready to be put in the hands of customers, hopefully as a transaction this time in a few months.
Sweet. So we originally built our boba machine in East Campus, and that did well, but we found that we had to make the machine at least try to pass FDA guidelines. And so that required just completely resetting everything, like coming up with new ingredients. And we found that with those constraints, it didn't taste nearly as good. And that was from user testing. We built it in San Francisco and had people try it out. So that's when we decided to pivot. And so our current product that we are selling right now is applyhood.com, which is a high school college application advice service, and it basically is 1/100 of the cost of normal traditional advising, with the goal of kind of adding technology to an old industry.
Yeah, so to add numbers to this, previously in East Campus, we sold, every 2 weeks we were selling around 500 cups of boba for $3.50 each. People were drinking them and they liked it. For Applyhood, we've done over 100 high school students already, some of whom have gotten into MIT, Caltech, Princeton, Carnegie Mellon. So we're actually actively selling stuff at the moment. Unfortunately, because we're in school right now, we kind of put a pause on that. So we're not really doing anything new. We're just still running Applyhood at this point.
Nice. So we're coming up on the break. We'll stick around and do some informal discussion if you want to come down. I know we're supposed to give you a stretch break at 7:25. A sort of extra credit question you might want to ask each other or ask these folks is, what's the vibe of an MIT startup? If those of you who have friends from other schools or have visited other places, is there something unique about being an MIT startup? And talk to each other about that as well. And if you want to send me your answers to that, I'll repost my email address at the beginning of this slide. And I'm happy to talk to all of you as well if you have questions for me. So join me in welcoming and thanking our panel. And I guess we're going to have a break, and then Joe's going to talk about law, right? Any announcements?
No, actually, we're going to do something different, but I'll tell them after the break.
Okay.
Okay.
You're pivoting, huh?
I'm pivoting, yes, okay. Thank you, Ken. This is, we've had panels before, and they've often been people that have been out running companies for 10 years. This is really good to see people that are virtually just the next step along, accelerating, using the same things we're talking about here and you do in Founder's Journey. So it's really, it's a really good panel for that purpose, and wish you guys well. Come back in 5 years. Okay, thank you.
Yep.